Okay, welcome to the audio recorded lecture for Daoism and Confucianism, week eight, corresponding to week 8 of RST 61-161. And this is actually the optional material, so I'm very pleased that you've decided to tune into this. Um, so we had a variety of different readings that were assigned, including the Fisher chapter for this, and then also a reading on the principle of yi or change, relating to the classic Chinese text, the I Ching. Um, and then a couple of videos, a video on Wu Wei, a video on Lao Tzu, a video on the Kongzi. So we have, which is Confucius and Lao Tzu, the founders of Confucianism and Taoism, respectively. Confucius is like an anglicized version of Kongzi. Um, so I want to just kind of cover, I want to make some kind of preliminary remarks. Some of what's covered and some of should be kind of new insights to consider. So um, yeah, so one thing to consider when we're talking about Chinese religions is that there's really first of all, that you cannot really consider these, even though these traditions are distinct and separate in many respects, for most Chinese individuals, there tends to be more of a permeability between them. Um, and even like a functionality of where they're not totally set, like they can be integrated. And there's what the term in religious studies is called, a formal term is called syncretism, where different strands or strains of different religious teachings can be kind of blended into one kind of fluid spirituality. So there's different in the Chinese context. This happens all across the world, but it's a very pronounced case in both ancient China and even in modern China as well, where these different streams, including Buddhism as well. We've already addressed Buddhism separately, but there's a saying in China called "San Jiao Fa Yi," which means like um, three streams flow into one. San Jiao Fa Yi, and that refers to Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, and the notion that all three of them can be kind of combined into one's life. A person can be kind of like affiliated with all three. And the notion almost is that, like, that each teaching contains practical wisdom that one can apply, and a different kind of wisdom to different kind of modes of life. And on top of that, there's a sense of like almost like one can be an insurance policy for the other, so that they're sort of overlapping, and that if you kind of have all your bases covered. um, so to yeah. There's a quote from Houston Smith, a really famous religious studies scholar, great scholar, um, and he writes his own world religions book that I highly recommend, by the way. Um, and actually, probably the strongest chapter in that book is his coverage of Confucianism. Is really exceptional. So if you are really interested in Confucianism, that would be a great source to check into. His chapter on Confucianism in that World Religions book, Houston Smith. But he has a quote here that I want to share on this principle of the three streams flowing into one. He says, traditionally, every Chinese person was Confucian in ethics in public life, Taoist in private life and hygiene, and Buddhist at the time of death, with a healthy dash of shamanistic folk religion thrown in along the way. So that's the other thing that considers that I've mentioned three of the streams, but there's actually really four different ones, and one of them is not really so much a tradition as an ancient kind of heritage, which is called folk tradition, and also can be there's shamanistic practice dating to ancient times, but it's also the ancestral veneration. So in a lot of Chinese homes, you'll have an ancestral altar and an ancestral tablet, and offerings are made to the ancestors, with the understanding that you're honoring them and remembering them and giving them these offerings, and then they're giving you like kind of protective guidance as an ancestor and giving you blessings from this unseen world that it happens to be coterminous or overlaps with the world of the living. And so that would be as a spirit, as the word in Chinese is Shen. And then there's also the world of ghosts, which the word for that is Gui. And you have the notion is that you want to be careful. There can be a malicious ghost, and so in this context, you have to be careful to, almost have like veneration of the ancestors on one hand, but then also kind of protection from the malevolent ghosts that could be throwing havoc into the world or getting revenge or whatever the case may be. So it's really just, there's really more like, even though the saying is 3 streams flowing into one, it's really more like 4. And then in modern times you also have after the communist revolution very strong Marxist thought. So you could also maybe, and that led to the repression of of many of these traditions. Confucianism was kind of blended in with Marxism, whereas Daoism and Buddhism and the folk traditions took a back seat. And maybe they were preserved privately in one's home, but it wasn't something that you could publicly celebrate through the revolution, which was very against religious practices, seeing it as kind of senseless or meaningless or not productive of this Marxist society that's supposed to be like kind of grounded in reason and so on and so forth. What I want to share one other quote regarding this notion of the 3 into 1, and this comes from Amy Wiegand, and so she says, referring to Chinese individuals, they typically engage in practices associated with each of the traditions, according to the purposes to be served, and are not concerned about doctrinal inconsistencies. So that's a really important point, that yes, on the surface there are very clear contrasts between Daoism and Confucianism and Buddhism and then folk traditions, but there's a sense in which the doctrinal inconsistencies, or the ways that there would be dissonance or conflict between these different teachings, tends to be not. It's just something that is considered. It's it's almost like these teachings can apply to different spheres of life, and it's especially the pragmatic and practical facets of it. If they promote prosperity, some of the main kind of values and ideals in Chinese spirituality or health, well-being is again like prosperity. You have to promote health, fulfilling relationships, harmony in the home and within society. I mean, these are kind of generalizations, of course, but the idea is that these traditions can be used as instruments for these values that are kind of taken as self-evidently good and beneficial and worth pursuing. So we see the image of Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu was. We don't know if he really even existed, but he's said to be somewhere between the 6th and the 4th century. My inclination there is that there was probably someone named Lao Tzu who had these writings, and then there may have been different legends that were made of him. One of the legends is that he was leaving the China as this hermit, this really wise sage, and then this border guard stopped him, and then recognizing that this guy was like basically, you might say, a great sage, had all this wisdom, kind of required that he write down all his teachings, and then that was then Lao Tzu doing this became what's known as the classic text of Taoism, called the Tao Te Ching. Just to know that you see you see Taoism was spelled with a D here, and that's how it's pronounced. But sometimes it is spelled with a T, so you see that Tao, like it's Tao, you'll see it pronounced, or you'll see it spelled like that. But it is, usually even when you see it with a T, you pronounce it Tao. And then you see the Taiji symbol, which is the yin and the yang symbol. So we'll get into what this represents within Taoism as later in the lecture. Um, and then we see a Chinese watercolor painting in the top, and I think this can be kind of tied in to both traditions. Kind of what the water, even the experience of painting a watercolor painting, and then it just, you can see a lot of the values that are kind of inscribed within what do we see within this natural setting, and like the flowing of the water, and one of the things about yin and yang is that there's the bright side of the mountain that's kind of a representative of yang energy. Yin energy is this darker side of the mountain. We can already see this kind of the shady, like if you're on the shady side of a mountain, you feel this kind of charged, ionized energy, kind of this certain kind of energy that you can kind of feel, and that's representative of yin energy. And then you see in especially with this extreme value in Taoism, you see a little bit. Actually, is this one? The other one I'm going to shows a little bit of human habitation that is very much unassuming, that really flows in with nature. So it's not, the idea is that is a human habitation or buildings shouldn't be imposing upon the natural setting, but should flow with them. And so you can, we looked at Wu Wei, and that expresses this value of Wu Wei. And then you can tie in this to different Confucian virtues as well. We'll explore another watercolor painting later. But this is, and then this is a representation of Confucius, who was said to be in the 6th and 5th century BCE. So there are, according to some tradition, that Lao Tzu is said to be an older contemporary, so of Kongzi or Confucius. And so we don't know that, but that there could be some reason, some political reason later in the history, why you would associate those two together, for the sake of kind of celebrating the national heritage within China. Down here you see the Chinese Chinese characters for Li, this central Confucian virtue that can be translated as ritual propriety. I think that the one thing about that translation, I think, is it's very much like, you could say, ritual, like we think of in the West, like certain rituals really formal, but ritual can also just be social. The idea that, like, all of different social events within a family or in a public setting, that there's already kind of this social script that's very much emphasized. That in modernity in the West, we have these values of, like, we can do what, we have really strong liberty. We can kind of be spontaneous in whatever direction we go. And there's kind of this rebelliousness against one's elders, a rebelliousness against the state that's very much counter to a lot of traditional Chinese cultural norms. And so there's a sense of ritual propriety, but it's like very much can apply to just at eating dinner in a home, or it's a sense of social proper conduct within a social unit as well. And so we'll explore what that means in a little bit greater detail as we go here. And so just to note that these two figures, Lao Tzu and Kongzi or Confucius, was they're tied in with what is known as all this emergence of all these great historical figures, connected with a certain philosopher called Karl Jaspers, called the Axial Age. And the Axial Age refers to the emergence. It's kind of this notion of, like, this consciousness got to a certain point of advance and sophistication, that you saw all these great teachers that brought virtue and insight across cultures around the same time. So it's like culturally emerging. If any of us studied the psychological insights of Carl Jung, you would understand this notion of the collective unconscious, that there can be this notion that across the world there's almost like shared thought, almost like the notion of a cloud in the internet or something, like that there's shared psyche, that the thought can be transmitted across cultures. So if some insight emerges in one culture, potentially that could be emerging in the collective psyche in another culture. So, but another way that you could say that, not leaning on that interpretation whatsoever, is just to say that cultures at this time were developing, technologically developing to a point of stability. And so they were being, agriculture had emerged, and governments had emerged, writing had emerged, and there's, some level of kind of political organization that was developing. And so because of all these different advances in technology, that led to this stability that kind of allowed then for these, like, um, these traditions, religious and philosophical traditions, to emerge. So we have, again, Lao Tzu and Confucius here, but we also, this is at the same time that we see in the context of ancient Greece, we have first the pre-Socratic philosophers, but then Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, all very much like kind of like right in this kind of central time of, 5th, 4th century BCE. And then you have in India, the Buddha and Mahavir, from Buddhism and Jainism. Krishna from Hindu tradition is said to, even though that's also a figure that we don't know if he really lived or not, but he's given these dates as well. And let's see, there's a few others that I'm leaving out, but just to know that this is, like, that's one way to think about this too, is, or to kind of realize, is that this kind of corresponds to a lot of different religions kind of surfacing. The biblical prophets are another one that's mentioned, like in the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures. Some of these prophets are dated around the same time, maybe a little bit earlier than like more like the 6th or 7th century BCE, but around the same time. And so you have all this, social teachings of justice and ethical teachings that are emerging. Okay, and then this last point I want to make here is to consider. It's important to consider, both these traditions emerge out of the kind of ancient teachings and traditions that go back all the way to the Shang dynasty, in which was like dated. I think Fisher dates it later than I've usually see. Usually it's dated like going all the way back to like 2100 BCE, and I think she puts it at like 1600, and then that goes all the way to the Chu dynasty, which is like an 11th, midway through the 11th century BCE, and so you have a change of dynasties, but so Chinese civilization emerged a long time ago. Even at like 3000 BCE, we see different artifacts being recovered from this period, and a lot of the practices there were, shamanistic, and giving offerings to grave goods that were placed with placed with bodies. And so we can start to piece together that there's an agricultural civilization that was emerging along the Yellow River. But for instance, yin and yang from Daoism, that actually was a concept that was already being understood prior to Daoism. So Daoism kind of put its own spin on this concept. The concept, Confucius, or Kongzi, was known as the lover of ancients. So this is someone who took a lot of like tradition, and then just he didn't reinvent the wheel. He just kind of emphasized and kind of systematized his teachings based on things that principles that he had already learned and celebrated. So like Li is something that pre-existed the coming of Confucius. He just, it was kind of like he was kind of, it must be understood through this kind of political environment where he was emphasizing that this was a solution to this larger issue of the upheaval and violence and chaos that was happening in Chinese society at this time, where he was saying we have to return to a traditional virtue and rights, and then he emphasized all these things like learning and various other virtues as well. But just to note that both these traditions very much presupposed teachings that were already existing in a lot of cases. So another thing that they also the notion of Tao means the way, and this was something that there was different teachings about. Like the way is connected to this notion of like the will of the universe, so then the Taoist text, the Tao Te Ching, and the day means like potency, and that's also a concept that was understood, that like potency comes to those who act virtuously in the world. It's like almost like a grace or a power that's granted on high from it's called, then this notion is called Tianming, the mandate of heaven, where heaven is a little bit, it's more like heaven can be more like the universe or a great spirit, you might say, from above, that grants people power that act virtuously. So this, and then again, Li is so Li, I know I'm kind of going all over the place here, but so the notion here is that the Temple of Heaven that you would do initially in the Shang Dynasty, you would do the rulers would do rites, these formal rites, making offerings to this great kind of almost like a god, a great ancestor called Shang Di. So this ancestor on high is the way to translate that. This great kind of god that through the offerings made to this great ancestor or this great god that that the reciprocity there would be that would bring blessings of like agricultural harvest, fecundity. So it would like lead to a great harvest. It would be like military protection, harmony within society, all of these things that were really important. That any society was like essential to, especially at this time, like really relying upon this kind of good fortune emerging within society. And then there was also part of the I Ching was that determining the will, using divination techniques to determine what the will of this a great being was. So that was in the Shang Dynasty, but this whole thing undergoes a kind of a revolution of thought in the Chu Dynasty. Because then later it was not the ruler that did the rites, but it was the dynasty that was the most virtuous, that so it was the dynasty that was most virtuous, that would be the ones that could have the right to rule. This mandate of heaven would flow through them because it was they were engaging. It wasn't the rights anymore, but their righteousness. They're kind of taking this mantle of leadership and properly applying it and leading the people correctly. And then, so this is something in Confucianism that he picks up on and talks about Li, right conduct, and Dai, this moral potency that flows through the individual that's upright and practices these virtues. So it's not just exclusive to the ruling class, but it's kind of democratically available to every individual, that this will, power, this kind of flow of grace comes from your ability to adhere, to behave virtuously. So you can see this kind of evolution of these kind of key principles across the history of Chinese civilization. And so, yeah, this temple in Beijing, you can go here. This is where they would make offerings, and this is this is a later. I think this was built in the Ming Dynasty, like later in like the 16th or 15th century. I forget exactly when, but it's basically a replication of what would have been at an earlier time, or in the ancient setting. But that's the notion that like it's reaching like it really illustrates the notion of Tianming, where you make offerings and then almost rains down blessings and of again fortune and good harvest and all these things that are valued. Okay, so that was a lot of time on that first slide, I realize, but I think it for good reason to kind of establish these key concepts. Just to touch kind of briefly here on the life and thought of Master Kongzi or Confucius. So the traditional dates that it's given, 551 to 479 BCE, the state of Lu, which is actually close to where Beijing is now today, a little south of where Beijing is. And so this was the state that he was in. And when he lived, there was a lot of social upheaval, and it was a lawless kind of time within Chinese history. And so that was kind of one of the things that he was addressing, is that the solution to all the social problems that we're having, all the violence, all the chaos, is these virtues like learning, and these virtues that I'm trying to establish, and following the traditions of the ancients. So Confucian is very much a this world involved path that like good happiness derives from order within society, and so you adhere to this kind of, it's a a little bit more of a conservative notion in some ways, but that you by behaving, by respecting those who became before you, that you work towards social order that is like kind of the foundation for all these other that things that are cherished within life and in society. um, so yeah, so he learned, he was engrossed in his learning, and he worked as a tutor, or later as a teacher with disciples, and so he was teaching the noble class, um, and um, yeah, so this Ru Jiao, lover of ancient. So the notion of Ru is like a kind of a gentleman or gentle person character. This refined individual that has a kind of a gentle quality about themselves through the learning that they've cultivated. Um, and he did this notion about failure to achieve. I mean, he was wildly successful, but in his lifetime, his kind of main goal was to reform society and get people to listen to him and be a great a figure that really transformed society. And the gist of that is that never really manifested. It was more that his teachings were recorded, and he had these ideals that didn't really filter into society. Though later, during the Han Dynasty, as you see at the bottom here, that was when these teachings, which had been written down, all of a sudden then became highly influential. And then at that time, it was from that point forward, his thought and legacy was really really influential upon Chinese culture and politics and everything. So yeah, then his 3,000 disciples and 70 pupils, I guess you could say. The Analects record a lot of these conversations that he has with people asking him. He used the Socratic method of asking questions to kind of generate deeper philosophical or deeper speculation, kind of digging into the core essence of things. And a lot of his sayings are like wise sayings on all these different virtues that I'm going to show you in a second, are recorded in the Analects. So and then again, here's this kind of portrayal of him. So let's go into these virtues, and I have a couple quotes to share on a couple of these. So let's start with this. Right, this is actually a separate slide that was created, and I found it online. But it's the 5 relationships, and it's kind of you can see the patriarchal legacy, and this is one of the, I think, criticisms that's leveled towards Confucianism, is that it is a kind of a more patriarchal tradition, because it emphasizes kind of the father as the head of the household, and kind of a notion of like a male version of an emperor as the head of society. So I'll try to, I actually couldn't find one that showed it differently, but it says father, child here, but you could also just as well say parent and child in a more general sense. And then it says a ruler and subject. And then husband and wife. What you're seeing here is already is like one of these is like considered to have authority, or superior would be maybe the wrong translation, but one is like supposed to be deference to the other, show deference to the other, and kind of follow the authority of the other. And so there's a sense of like in a family unit, it's called shao, filial piety, that the children show their parents, so they follow their instructions. You show your love through listening to your parents and serving them. And then this kind of model applies to all of society. So I mentioned husband, wife, elder brother, younger brother, which could just be elder sibling, younger sibling. Yeah, another one is a friend to a friend. I think this is also, if I'm not mistaken, it's the elder friend is supposed to be the one that's considered. I don't think this is considered to be an equal to equal. I have to double check that. But then, yeah, you see this quote here: "Well governed, when all the parties perform their parts aright in these relationships." So you can think of this as like starting in the home, starting in, actually not even more than the home, one's relationship with one another. That this is like almost like the nucleus of harmony and order within all of society. So all of these kind of relationships that show deference to authority, and I think, again, coming from a Western context, there's a sense that this is like wrong and should definitely be challenged. But there's a sense here that like if you think about like just relying upon the like listening to one's grandparents and the value of like taking their advice to heart because they've lived life, they've gone through, they've gone around the merry-go-round go round more than we have as younger people, and so just the notion that like it makes kind of sense for it to kind of flow for their authority to have a little bit more weight than maybe a younger person. Um, and so, anyway, yeah, so that's just something just to consider. And then, so to go through each of these virtues, we have the li. I talked about that. So that can be both, yeah, like rites, formal rites, like a funeral rite. You would say that you'd have to show a lot of respect for the deceased individual, and one's aunt. That this is also like another kind of relationship that one's ancestors are really important to honor. Um, and then like so that whole rite would have like a very formal social script that you're supposed to be like grieving is supposed to be conducted a certain way. Everything is kind of enacted through showing respect, um, and there's not a lot of too much spontaneity that's built into it. It's really kind of traditional, go along prescripted traditional lines. And then we have Ren, and this is Ren is goodness or benevolence, like humanness. This is Confucianism is very much a humanistic tradition. So the notion here is that it's like one it connects with their natural, innate goodness. A later Confucian philosopher named Mencius, he really emphasized that human nature is good, and so it's just a little bit of cultivation that naturally brings out the goodness of human beings. Kongzi, Confucius, wasn't himself that much of an optimistic about human nature, but in general, he thought that if you cultivate the spirit, if you cultivate learning, then eventually these virtues do emerge. And then you have this notion of a chunzi. You see it there as junzi, but it's more pronounced like chunzi. And so this is like a superior person, or this virtuous person, and these are related. Like these are the qualities that you also want to show in these relationships that you see on the right. Like the deference is one thing, but also the goodness that you show, the virtue and the benevolence that you show within these relationships. And so almost like these, if you can do that in a relationship, that's like kind of like the key to order, preserving order and harmony within the society at large is starting in these individual relationships. There's a really powerful quote that Kongzi or Confucius has about this. So he says, if there is righteousness in the heart, there will be beauty in the character. If there is beauty in the character, there will be harmony in the home. If there is harmony in the home, there will be order in the nation. If there is order in the nation, there will be peace in the world. So you see how it starts in the heart, righteousness, cultivating this virtue, righteousness in the heart, this goodness, and then that you have character going out from character to harmony in the home, and then so you see all these relationships again, the 5 relationships, and then harmony in the home, order in the nation, so society at large, and then order in the nation, peace in the world. And so this larger notion of harmony that's like it permeates even beyond society, almost like permeating into this metaphysical dimension or this relationship between society and the notion of tian, or this notion of heaven, or the mandate of heaven. So just to note there, that again, you can think of it like these concentric circles that go outward. It's first the individual virtue, and then these relationships in the home, relationships in larger society, like the ruler to subject, and then this connection that all of these in being practiced with deference, respecting elders, and showing goodness in these relationships is the key to the order of all society. We have yi, righteousness, similar to what we're talking about. So that would be the. It could these are kind of interchangeable when it comes to ren and yi, goodness and righteousness. These are These are really important virtues that emanate outwards in both cases. But the day, moral virtue. So One way to think about this would be, like um, that there's a certain kind of authenticity in people that maybe are like speaking the truth or dramatic or something, but there's a sense of persuasion that when someone is acting justly, it matters less about how polished their message is or something. It's just it rings true with a certain authenticity because there's a moral kind of virtue that is behind them. And so, people who are virtuous kind of have this, the ideas that people that have this, that practice virtue and are upright and embody these various principles have this kind of power, this potency behind them. Um, and we're going to see this word reemerge later with the Tao Te Ching, which translates as the way, the classic or the book of the way, and its potency. So the notion that again, this is kind of a power that one imbibes, but in that case through aligning themselves with this Tao, this unnameable source, um, and so. Or unable, unseen flow is another way. We'll get to that, but and then when we have refinement through learning in the arts, and he has a really powerful quote on this that I'd like to share as well. So he says, Kong Zi says, therefore the noble person tries to create harmony in the human heart by rediscovery of human nature, and tries to promote music as a means to perfection of human culture. When such music prevails and the people's minds are led toward the right ideals and aspirations, we may see the appearance of a great nation. Right there, you really see this notion of like the arts and inspiration that's found through music and learning and great ideas, philosophy, that this kind of the liberal arts, that one's kind of a dedication to that is hugely important for inspiring a nation and letting the right kind of ideals rather than these vices emerge. So it's like the cultivation of this kind of virtue is very essential, and it can be accomplished through the arts and learning. And then shu, reciprocity. So that's a concept of like it's another one of these pre-existing concepts in ancient China. And the notion what there can be in all these relationships, there's reciprocity. These five relationships, it really shows up between one's ancestors and the living descendants. So like they would make offerings, and then again they receive in reciprocity of that for that, like I said, kind of this prosperity and protection. The ancestors' blessings flow from the ancestors. But here in this context of Confucianism, there's more a sense of like looking out for this other person and they look out for you. And so don't kind of this notion of the golden rule, treating others as you want to be treated, and as someone treats you, make sure you're treating them back with that same respect. So it kind of takes on its own kind of connotation or emphasis there. And then Z, wisdom. So there's a notion here that this kind of emerges. And he was very humble. Humility is another important Confucian virtue. Confucius was very humble about his own cultivation of wisdom, really saying that it's only like really late in life that people kind of become wise and are able to do any of these virtues in a way that's like really exemplary. It takes a long time to cultivate all this. And then Shin, and I may be mispronouncing that, but it's this notion of trustworthiness. And so you see on all of this that there's a real sense of character and integrity. So to go into to transition into Daoism. So if we look at the symbol down here of the Taiji symbol, we see these two kind of fundamental, starkly opposed, diametrically opposed energies, or principles. You can say principles, energies of yin and yang. So the yin is represented by the black, the yang is represented by the white, and you see the dot. There's a dot in the middle of the black. So yang, and then there's a black dot in the middle of the white. And the notion there is that the one aspect interpenetrates into the other, and so these energies are like in constant interaction with one another. They produce change in the world. They produce the world and they cause dynamism because it's always this unstable kind of flow between both energies, and these two energies together produce what's called like chi energy. So if you've heard of like qi gong, it's this kind of production of this or this generation through it's a Chinese traditional art where you're generating this chi energy, which is supposed to be have really great benefits for cultivating a peaceful mode of consciousness and generating health in the body. This flow of this energy is composed of these these polarized energies of yin and yang, and so the yin energy, and the whole world is like understood to be like composed of chi energy fundamentally. So it's like these energies are almost like all pervasive, you could say, and they're within the body, they're within the world itself, and it's like even though the world seems stable, it's like throbbing with these different fundamental primordial energies. The yang energy is known as like equated with the sunny side of a mountain. It's known for like as being assertive, creative, active, and then the yin is like noted for like being more passive, receptive, kind of like a coolness about it. So that's like the shadowy side of the mountain. And it just has like a certain kind of feeling to it. And so like sometimes the yin will be equated with the energy of the moon, and the yang will be equated with the energy of the sun. And it's just, these kind of fundamental, just again, like principles or energies that one is like within the other. They're kind of like when the idea here is too, is that like there's a general kind of harmony of the flow between one and the other. So practically speaking, if one becomes too strong, there's a sense in which you would want to balance that out with the other. And there's also a sense in which you can like understanding that if one principle is like really strong, if yang energy is really strong, or yin energy is really like predominant, then you could try. You want it to become a little bit more balanced. You want the energy to be flowing in the other direction because it represents a kind of disharmony if it's like so strong in one direction. And there's the notion here in Daoism is that the notion of wu wei, which I'll touch upon in a second in greater detail. But that the notion is sometimes you just let things be and they'll become an opposite. So like the yang, a really active or energy, or you could say even a figure that is like this, coming with this really strong energy. If you just let the energy go, let that be expressed, like it's incorporated within like martial arts, like judo or something. You let that force, that's a strong force, come at you. It has its own momentum, and it can be counteracted through just letting, not standing against it, but just letting it flow. And so the idea here is that in a larger sense, that sometimes like if you just let things go as they are, they will naturally find equilibrium. And so there's kind of this patient approach of watching rather than inserting oneself in a situation. There's a sort of wisdom there. And so that's the notion of like anything that's like the yin in its really strongest form is naturally going to like at that point in time, just as the day becomes night and the night becomes day, naturally become its opposite. And so this is like you see that expressed with the black being in the middle of the white and the white being expressed in the middle of the black. And so there's a lot of different applications to this kind of wisdom. It's in the Tao Te Ching. And it can be incorporated to feng shui, which is like you've heard of that term probably, like arranging one's living room or something. But it's like the notion that there's certain flows of yin energy that are good for certain things, and certain flows of yang energy that are better for other things. And you want to like these flows the way that you set up one's house, or if it's a grave site, or I mean a cemetery, or a city center, that you have these flowing energies based on how you set things up, arrange things. And so one would want to take into account these different flows of energy to depending on if they're looking for a certain kind of environment to suiting a certain activity. But in general, there's a sense of harmony, and you don't want it to be too strong of yang energy or yin energy in one direction. because it will bring forth, it's going to have a negative impact because it's so out of balance. Um, that's a simplistic version of it, but that's I think a kind of a general upshot of these two as it can apply to this notion of feng shui. Um, and then if you see this Chinese watercolor painting over here to the right, mountains are equated with yang as well, the notion of like a mountain, and then the water flowing downward is equated with yin energy. So here, it's also an expression of yin and yang in a way, just the nature, the pattern of nature. But I also show this because here you can see this notion of wu wei, and the notion here is that you have this little habitation down here, and first of all, you notice that it's like very much, you can't even hardly see it. It's very much working with the natural landscape. So it's like in harmony with the natural landscape. It's not imposing itself and changing the fundamental order of the landscape. And you also have the notion here that it's like the mountains are kind of serving as a natural protective barrier for, let's say, if there's strong winds going through there. And the water, that this yin energy, this softer yin energy, that would be good for like when it's a little bit more predominant, to be able to live by there. There's like a sense of natural kind of peacefulness and a softness that would be living alongside the flowingness of the river. And so one's like, consciously working into the landscape, the energetic flow in such a way that harmony is going to manifest, blessings are going to manifest, because one had an intention about how is that energy kind of currents that one can kind of not see but are there. How do we fit in and align ourselves with that? So this is kind of like the metaphysics of yin and yang, and of course there's more of a philosophical dimension to it, and we can talk about Taoism has different schools. It represents like a ritual Taoism. There's more of a philosophical Taoism, which focuses on like the text and the philosophy of the Tao Te Ching, and applied to all these different spheres of life. And then there's also like a Taoism that focuses on the body and even attaining like immortality. The one thing about Taoism is that it's more of this. It's not like world. It's kind of a little bit more escaping from the world, or like turning away from it, not caring about one's titles or social order as much, kind of like turning away from it and finding, letting the world be the world, and by one's withdrawing from the world, everything kind of takes care of itself, and then this is the place where one can like really develop this, kind of become merged with the Tao, excuse me, can kind of go deeper into one's consciousness. There's meditation practices in Taoism, but it's when you're in the kind of the ruckus of everyday life, it's going to be hard to kind of find these like rhythms, these deeper rhythms, and then merge with them. So there's a sense of like escaping into the mountains and becoming like a Taoist hermit, and then anyway, there's all the different traditions. I'm kind of jumping around here a bit, so I apologize. And then to move on to this short coverage, to Wu Wei, actionless action. So we saw the School of Life video, which I think covered this concept really, really nicely. So this is again, there's no taking no. It's not It's not so much non-action as actionless action. So the notion here is that there's a certain flow, there's a natural order, there's a natural kind of progression of the way things unfold, and if one finds like harmony with that, they flow with that, then that's the wiser approach. And so here we have, especially this, there's a couple quotes from the Tao Te Ching, the fundamental Taoist religious text. The second one especially, the first one is the first kind of classic quote that I want to mention. But the second one, let's turn our attention to the bottom one in this chapter 29 excerpt, which really illustrates Wu Wei. And there's a lot of different verses in the Tao Te Ching that do this. But it says, the master sees things as they are. Without trying to control them, she lets them go their own way and resides at the center of the circle. So here you have a sense of like taking no action contrary to nature. You're moving with nature, and you're residing at the center of the movement, but with you're not trying to control it. You're not trying to impose your order upon anything. And again, kind of again going back to like where does one place one's house, or what if one's trying to exert some influence in the world? How is the best way to do that? Is standing against what are the and then trying to oppose it is going to create all these problems. Every action has a reaction, but if one kind of flows with it, then they can kind of be a steward, kind of a wiser steward of letting things kind of manifest in the way that nature would have them be. And so, yeah, there's a sense here of like kind of waiting and watching, and then going with the flow of things, and that's the wisest way. So this is the situation, kind of preserve one's energies, and then go with the way that if there's a certain conversation is going a certain way, let's say, to move with what is like the instead of like, okay, you have these directives that you wanted to share in this conversation. What are other people saying, and how can you kind of work in harmony with that? And then that's going to generate like all these like a trust and a sort of flow in that relationship in the conversation. And then maybe later in the conversation you can turn to the directives that you or whatever agenda that you would wanted to mention. Seeing things as they are and not overly inserting oneself, but letting things kind of unfold naturally. That there's a sort of a natural power that results from that. A lot more can be said about actionless action, and this is really the best coverage of it. But I think if you just the School of Life video, I think covers it well enough. So I think we can just leave it at that. But lastly, I want to go turn to this the first kind of the very first few lines of the Tao Te Ching. So the notion here is that the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The Tao is both named and nameless. As nameless, it is the origin of all things. As named, it is the mother of 10,000 things. So there's a lot of different ways that this text can be interpreted. There's a lot of ways that it can be applied. The last two lines, it shows how it's kind of at once this kind of unseen essence to the world. Is the origin, it's nameless, that you can't name it, origin of all things. So it's like this kind of this unspoken or ineffable, indescribable kind of mystery that's within the world, and a flow, kind of an underlying purpose, maybe you could say, that is, very extremely mysterious. But it's like 10,000 things. The notion that it's like everything kind of emanates from this source. But the notion here that the main thing is that I want to that this quote kind of shows is that one can't really wrap one's head around. It can even though it's the source from which everything derives, you can't really put your finger. It's like this larger mystery, or it can be translated as like this unseen kind of like a metaphysical substratum of the world that's just like a source of all things. But the Tao can also be translated as the way. So it's like the way that things want to unfold. So it's this mysterious term that it's kind of escapes one's a rigid definition. But there's a sense in which whatever it is, one can kind of begin as in their life to become attuned to it and then emerge with it. So whether it's a higher reality or whether it's a kind of a natural wise flow of things, one can become attuned to it through kind of, again, withdrawing oneself from too much activity, kind of watching how things, taking no action that's contrary to the Tao, and going deeper and deeper into it. And then that's where, all this happiness derives from that. Deeper wisdom derives from that. And it's even a sense of like this, higher magic of the world, you might say. This deep mystery, one can kind of get lost in the Tao, this deeper mystery. And again, this is more of a religious and philosophical Taoism. But there's these covering Wu Wei. It's a little bit of an evasive concept. So I encourage you to go back and look at those, listen to those School of Life videos again, to kind of get to grasp these subtle concepts a little bit more clearly. But yeah, then again, you see this image on the right of this natural landscape, even as a final note, in the painting of these natural landscapes, there's a sense in which you're not supposed to imitate it perfectly, but or replicate the exact order of the nature, but you're supposed to kind of like imbibe the spirit of it, and again, kind of like merge with the spirit or the Tao of it, and then that way, by just doing it naturally, then it's just the order of it, takes place. I like to think of, like, if anybody here has watched like the painting of Bob Ross, the person with like the afro, he has a very much of a kind of a Taoist spirit and methodology to the way he paints. He can paint this incredible painting, a landscape painting, and he does it within the span of like 20 minutes, just through these kind of natural techniques, and just obviously he's very skilled, um, but he just through kind of like being in the right spirit of nature, just, rather than like focusing on these fine details, overthinking it, just flow. Like, it's a very much a methodology of flowing into it, and then you see this tremendous like tremendous representation of nature, because the person was in that mindset or that spirit that produced it. So this is like, these any of the arts, traditional arts, whether it's painting or writing a haiku, or writing of a poetry, or doing producing music, is that like all of these in a Tao, from the Taoist or martial arts. So that, whether one is doing watercolor painting or martial arts or governing, um, or producing music or poetry, there's a sense in which you can emerge with this Tao, this kind of higher source of creativity, and then it just the harmony and the nature will naturally express itself, as one kind of gets out of the way. They don't overimpose or overthink the process, but as they just move with it, they become a natural expression of it, and it just kind of happens effortlessly. And that is also a translation of Wu Wei, effortless action. Okay, so a lot more could be said about all of this, but I hope this gives a little kind of a helpful coverage overview of what some of these terms mean in Taoism, and then also some of the core concepts within Confucianism as well. So thanks for tuning in, and I'm really impressed that that you applied yourself to learn these supplemental optional resources on Taoism and Confucianism. I would have loved to be able to integrate this into the regular curriculum. Obviously, given the shorter semester, we had to just make it optional. But I really do hope that you were able to do the readings, or apply yourself to all of these, engage all of these resources. So again, thank you for tuning in, and hope you have a great rest of your week.